diaspora and how we approach studying the diaspora. Yet her work and the work of her research team, ADRP, was rooted within Pan-African thought and connected that liberation consciousness of Pan-Africanism with how to decolonize and include and recenter African descended and African populations in knowledge production. So her proposition is that the African diaspora is a global phenomenon, a method of inquiry, an analytical perspective that helps us understand processes of social construction and identity formation in the modern world. It shifts the interpretive lens away from a Euro-Western-centric approach to centering the lives, worldviews, and creations of those who are part of the diaspora, situating the critical analysis from that perspective. This is necessary because of a concept Charles Long puts forth called signification, wherein as part of the colonizing project, European colonizers realized about 200 years in that they needed to intellectually justify the dehumanizing actions they were inflicting upon the world. And so they created the Enlightenment in order to separate people's normative relationship to the enchanted world, as well as, quote, rationalize how we conceptualize the human. Signification is so deeply embedded, and its project was to reinterpret and create new meanings for everyday language, how we go about understanding the world, and created knowledge production and social sciences as we know them today. My own discipline of sociology is a direct reflection of that, and I, along with many others in our discipline who are somewhat marginalized in this line of thinking, challenge the assumptions of those Western European thinkers on how the conceptualization of the human was created. I think Pan-African thought is a direct reflection of how the hypocrisy of the Enlightenment and the hypocrisy of those Western European thinkers, in that it calls out the singularity of how humanness was constructed intellectually, and helps us realize that it was wrong. It was a false concept that Europe created. The Hamilton paradigm, as the kind of third level of creating African diaspora studies towards a discipline, is rooted within the conceptualization of diaspora as contact zones. So zones where humans from different social groups were either forcibly brought, and then from the European side voluntarily came, and mixed, clashed, and grappled to form new ways of being that are distinctive to those particular locales. She puts forth four main categories of how to study these zones and how to study the diaspora. The first proposition is engaging this idea of dispersion, and not just dispersion in dispersion in the large sense, but also understanding the historical contextualization of dispersion. That these contextual variables include the particularity of the colonizer and how they implemented the socioeconomic colonial project, the relationship of the diaspora to the indigenous populations within the site, the particularities of African ethnic groups that were forcibly brought to the sites, and then the historical trajectory of conquest. There are two main dispersion phases within this kind of conceptualization. The Mafad dispersion, or the colonial project, and then what's called the new African diaspora, or is the dispersion of semi-voluntary and voluntary movement within the industrialized era. Then the second category is that within the diaspora, within these the social forces of the diaspora, there is a macro context of oppression and racialization that is locally implemented. This necessitates very understandings that white supremacy is a global force, but also that how white supremacy is implemented on a local level is distinctive across the various locales. Then the third category is a connection to the African continent as a homeland. Not necessarily the homeland, but a homeland. In the context of Cuba, this is really important. African descendants identify both Cuba and Africa as simultaneous homelands. And this category can be conceptualized as in both real and imagined ways. And then the last category, which I think embraces a lot of what the first two speakers were talking about, is that in diaspora, there's formed communities of consciousness and cultural production in order to maintain, sustain, and generationally transmit that consciousness of being in the diaspora. This is rooted in a consciousness of liberation and self-actualization, community formation, and then through all of that, cultural products that perpetuate these dynamics. Now, in how I apply this paradigm, I see it as merging Pan-African thought and this theoretical application into kind of one larger dynamic that connects both how we apply knowledge production, but also the practical implementation on a community level, bridging scholars and knowledge production into how can we actually help and serve communities. I think this is rooted in also embracing intersectionality. Intersectionality is a mode of thought that was originated by Kimberly Crenshaw and Black feminism in the United States, but that proposes that in the spectrum of social constructs, so race, class, gender, and sexuality, I also include worldview and cultural modalities in that, that they are intersecting social forces that create a spectrum of positionalities. I think this is essential in understanding the diaspora and identities in the diaspora as well. I also incorporate decolonial thought, given that my work is rooted in the Americas. I think decolonial thought engages how Europeans reconfigured notions of time and space. And within an African cosmic orientation, those are very important because time is conceptualized differently from Eurocentric worldview, and space has been part of the colonizing project. And it also respects the Cuban identity that is both Cuban and rooted in that land space and multi-ethnic and multifaceted, but connected to Africa and the diaspora. These dynamics are, as we approach all of the liberation movements that have been reignited, and as we face the everyday struggles of how global white supremacy is being inflicted on a local level, but patterned across not just the United States, but across the world, I think it's really important to recognize the continuation of these larger liberation movements that have been going on since colonization began, and that it's part of an ebb and flow of how structural oppression is inflicted. When we look at the larger trajectory of applying this paradigm theoretically, but also conceptualizing it on the ground in terms of liberation movements, if we kind of engage these propositions and appreciate how, on a spectrum, how they're implemented in parallel but distinctive ways, I think that can better help us conceptualize how to understand how music can embrace both local perspective and these kind of global notions of being diaspora members, as well as how to engage class positionalities. Within my work in Cuba, in Santiago de Cuba, I look at a community called Los Hoyos, which I propose has been one of the earliest free black communities in the Americas, but that history isn't really talked about. And if we look at Los Hoyos and we look at that particular space and appreciate how it has been at the epicenter of Cuban liberation movements rooted in the diaspora, and then how that affected larger liberation movements throughout the Americas, it is intimately rooted within the Haitian Revolution and intimately rooted within the development of the first black political party in the Americas, the Partido Independiente de Colón, which its members were tragically massacred in 1912. And these notions are connected, and I think by putting out the Hamilton paradigm and by engaging these propositions, it gives us a roadmap for how to engage and connect both the theory and the practice on a local level. So thank
you. And thank you. We're really looking forward to the completion of your PhD. And it's quite timely that we would have someone incorporate Cuba into the discussion of Pan-Africanism, particularly now with the change of American foreign policy toward Cuba, as well as the participation of the head of state, Fidel Castro's participation early on in the liberation struggle and the Pan-African movement through his funding to a number of countries on the African continent. And so a question just for you to perhaps just play around with is the sociological constructs that one needs to understand from the diasporic African presence, i.e. in Cuba. What are those indigenous sociological constructs, non-Western, non-European, that you have discovered that are relevant, and the implication of that into the Pan-African movement, particularly given the Yoruba centricity in Cuba emanating from the Nigerians that were exported to Cuba. That would be interesting. So our last panelist needs no introduction, but the way this will go is after he concludes his opening remarks, I've already asked each of the panelists to consider particular questions based on their opening remarks. So then, once he's done, we'll then return to Dr. Clark, who'll address the question, and Netfa, and so on. And then we'll open it up and have a fruitful interchange between the audience and the panelists. This gentleman, Uncle, I call him Uncle as a term of affection, is a PhD graduate from the African Studies Department. He's a Pan-Africanist, heavily engaged in a number of issues related to the continent of Africa in particular, and freedom struggles globally. I recently happened to be on YouTube doing some research, and there he was on a television show, I believe it was in Kenya or Nigeria, providing a very clear perspective on some of the challenges in Africa with one of the prominent professors from American University. So I'm very glad that he's here. Please, if you'd be so kind to welcome him, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Julius. I don't like too many compliments. And I don't trust any compliments. I'm used to hear bad things about myself, so I'm used to that. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm here, I represent the Revival of Pan-Africanist Forum, and I'm going to speak about Pan-Africanism. But before, because I'm one of the organizers of this conference, I want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank all of you. This conference is a success because of you. And if there was nobody here in this room, people will not be able to talk about this conference. So I want to thank you very much, and I'm really happy to see that, we are, your presence that goes beyond what I was expecting. Second, I want to, of course, Melvin Foot, his name is mentioned, he's one of our elders here. We appreciate him for his work, for his commitment to Africa. And after Melbourne, we have some usual faces here, and Jacqueline, and Msia, and Lucy Murphy, and many others. I want to thank them. I would like to thank also the Sankara family. When we talk about Pan-Africanism, there is a name. I think he died when he was 38, and he was the president of Burkina Faso. He used to be called Upper Volta from 1983 to 1987, in 4 years, and he advanced the Pan-African cause, and what he did, the one who killed him, who came after him, and who ruled the country for 27 years, could not do half of Thomas Sankara did in 4 years. And I have the honor, the privilege, to be doing this with the Sankara family. Yes, we have Pascal Sankara here and Paul Sankara, so I always acknowledge their presence. Pascal, and then Paul here, Okay. So this, I just want to say that. And other thing I want to say, I want to thank Sia Clark, Dr. Sia Clark. We're here because of her. And then she's the one who facilitated this conference. And then, of course, she gave a wonderful presentation. I want to thank my friends, Netfa Freeman. And he is a brother we can count on. He's been doing a wonderful job here. And then anything we do, we have to count on Netfa Freeman. Of course, I would like to thank also the chair of the Department of African Studies, Dr. Cham, who could not be here, and because he endorsed this conference. And one of the speakers, Josephine Dawoni from the Political Science Department, could not come because she has an issue, and she was dealing with something like at the house. And then so she asked me to present an apology to you all. And then this is how Alexandra replaced her, and Alexandra did a wonderful job. One more person, I want two other things. We have here Flavia Marquez from the Venezuelan Embassy. And then the lady over there. Flavia, can you show your earrings to the camera?
Hi.
There are two maps of